The ground outside Laramie didn't freeze all at once. It happened slowly, the way bad luck usually does. First the top layer hardening to a crust you could crack with a boot heel, then the deeper soil locking up inch by inch until everything underneath went solid and cold and indifferent. Clara Whitmore had been watching the ground freeze for 3 days before she understood that she was watching her husband die the same way. Thomas Whitmore had taken 2 bullets in the yard of his own property. On land he'd broken his back clearing over 11 years. The men who shot him had paperwork. That was the part that kept replaying in Clara's mind as she knelt beside him in the dirt, her hands pressing against wounds that were already beyond pressing. They had paperwork. Leather satchels full of documents bearing county seals and the signatures of men whose names she'd never heard. The kind of men who didn't come themselves. The kind who sent others. The foreman, a wide-necked man named Prairie, with a red beard and pale eyes that showed no particular feeling about anything, had handed her the eviction notice after Thomas stopped moving. Handed it to her the way you'd hand someone a receipt for something they'd already bought and paid for. He'd even said, "Sorry for your trouble, ma'am," which was the worst thing anyone had ever said to her in her entire life. She didn't remember folding the notice and putting it in her coat pocket. She didn't remember walking back to the house, where 8 of her 9 children were watching from the windows. She remembered Eliza, her oldest at 16, meeting her at the door with a look on her face that was trying hard to be calm and failing completely. She remembered Martin, 14, pushing past both of them to go stand over his father's body in the yard because somebody had to. What she remembered most clearly was little May, 5 years old, asking from the kitchen doorway, "Is Papa sleeping?" Clara had looked at her youngest daughter, small, dark-haired, with Thomas's same serious brown eyes, and for one long, terrible moment she couldn't speak. "Yes," Eliza said quietly, from somewhere behind her. "Papa's sleeping, Bug." It was a mercy and a wound at the same time. Dick. They buried Thomas in the back corner of what had been their property, under the cottonwood he'd planted the year Martin was born. The ground was already hardening, and the 3 oldest boys, Martin, 16-year-old Caleb, and 14-year-old James, had to work for 4 hours with picks before they got deep enough. Clara had dug beside them until Eliza made her stop, not gently. "Mama, you can't do this and also get us out of here tomorrow. Pick one." Eliza had inherited Thomas's practicality and Clara's stubbornness, which made her either the most useful person in any crisis or the most exhausting one to argue with. Clara had let herself be walked inside. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the eviction notice spread in front of her and tried to understand what she was reading. She'd had 8 years of schooling, enough to parse the legal language if she went slowly. What it said, underneath all the formal phrasing, was that a land syndicate called the Pinnacle Western Development Company had filed a prior claim on the Whitmore homestead based on a survey dispute dating back 14 years, a survey that Thomas had never heard of, filed by a county recorder who had since died, signed by a judge who had since moved to Denver. In other words, they had manufactured the theft, given it a paper trail, and made it look like correction. Clara read the document 3 times. Then she folded it back up and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, where she kept the things she intended to remember. 9 children. No land. Roughly $43 in a tin box under the floorboards, which she'd retrieved before Pruitt's men came back in the morning to change the locks. 2 horses. A wagon. What they could carry. She made a list. They left before dawn, which felt right. Not sneaking exactly, but something like refusing to be watched. Martin drove the wagon. Eliza sat beside him on the box. Clara rode one of the horses because sitting in the wagon made her feel like she was being transported somewhere against her will, and she needed the sensation of directing something, even if it was just an old roan mare named Pearl. The 7 younger children arranged themselves in the wagon bed among the quilts and the cooking pot and the flour sacks and the box of tools and the other horse tied to the back. They ranged from Caleb at 12 down to May at 5. Caleb, then Ruth at 11, then Daniel at 10, then the twins Horace and Henry at 8, then Lucy at 7, then May. Each of them had been told the night before that they were going to find somewhere better. Clara had said it as steadily as she could, and they had believed her with varying degrees of conviction. May had asked if Papa was coming, and Clara had finally told her the truth, kneeling on the kitchen floor to be eye level with her youngest, holding both small hands. May had cried very quietly for about 2 minutes, then asked if she could bring her tin cup with the painted flowers. "Yes," Clara said. "You can bring your cup." The morning they left, May carried the cup in her lap the entire way, both hands wrapped around it. The first town they reached was Haverford, a settlement of maybe 300 people with a main street of 6 or 7 buildings and a water trough out front of the general store that was still clean. Clara left the children in the wagon and went in alone to ask about work or temporary housing. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, with a mustache that made him look permanently skeptical, had looked past her to the wagon outside, where 9 children were visible in various states of fidgeting. "That your bunch?" he said. "Yes." He'd looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You got a husband?" "I did." The mustache shifted. "We don't have work for a widow with that many kids. Not seasonal, not permanent. Can't feed half the county on what we've got." "I'm not asking to be fed," Clara said. "I'm asking about work." "I heard you." He'd gone back to whatever he was writing. "Best move on." She'd gone back to the wagon and told the children they were moving on. Martin had looked at her but hadn't said anything. He was good at that, holding questions until the right moment or letting them go entirely. He was more like Thomas than he knew. Haverford was the first. After that came Dalton, where a woman on the porch of the boarding house had said, "We can't accommodate a family that size," and closed the door before Clara finished her sentence. Then Reeves Crossing, where 3 men at a livery stable had watched them pass with expressions ranging from pity to something uglier, and one of them had muttered something Clara didn't catch, but Eliza did, because Eliza's jaw went tight and she stared straight ahead and didn't speak for an hour after. "What did he say, sir?" Clara asked, once they were well past. "Nothing worth repeating," Eliza said. "Eliza." A pause. "He said someone ought to separate us. That 9 kids with no father and a widow with no land were 9 problems looking for someone else to solve them." Clara didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. By the 4th day, the $43 had become 31. Feed for the horses ate money. The limited food she'd thought would stretch wasn't stretching. The weather was holding, gray skies but no snow yet, which was its own small mercy. But the temperature was dropping every night, and the quilts were thick but not thick enough when the wind came through the canvas on the wagon. Caleb had developed a cough. It wasn't bad yet, but Clara heard it every morning and measured it the way you'd measure water in a bucket with a slow leak. Ruth had taken on the job of managing May, which nobody had assigned her but which she'd assumed naturally, the way the second most reliable child in a family always does. Ruth was 11 and had her mother's dark hair and her father's square jaw, and she had a patient manner with May that Clara was grateful for because her own patience, at this particular stretch of the road, was running thin in ways she was working hard not to show. Daniel was the quiet one. He'd always been quiet, even before. Now he barely spoke at all, but he worked without being asked, unhitching the horses at camp, hauling water when they stopped near a creek, helping Martin with the wagon wheel that had developed a wobble. He was 10 years old and he was doing the work of someone twice his age, and Clara watched him and felt something she didn't have a name for, something between pride and grief, because no 10-year-old should have to be that useful. The twins were the twins. Horace and Henry were 8 years old and had not yet fully processed that their circumstances had changed, or perhaps had processed it in the way that 8-year-olds do. Intensely for an hour, then not at all, then intensely again at unexpected moments. They bickered. They chased each other when there was space to chase. They asked questions that nobody could answer. "Why don't they want us in the towns?" Henry asked on the 4th day, sitting next to Clara on Pearl's back because she'd let him ride up for a while. Clara thought about how to answer that honestly. "Some people see a big family with not much money, and they get scared." "Scared of what?" "That we'll need something from them." Henry was quiet for a moment, working this out. "But we didn't ask them for anything." "No, we didn't." "That's stupid," he said, with the supreme confidence of an 8-year-old identifying adult stupidity. "Yes," Claire said, "it is." On the 5th day, Lucy stopped eating. It wasn't immediate. She'd been eating less for 2 days, and Clara had noticed but told herself it was the motion of the wagon, the change in routine, the stress that all of them were carrying in their own ways. But on the 5th morning, Lucy looked at the biscuit in her hand and put it down without taking a bite, and when Clara asked if she was all right, she said, "I'm not very hungry," in a voice that was too small. Lucy was 7. She was the one who'd always been most sensitive to the temperature in a room, most attuned to what people around her were feeling. She'd started crying the night Thomas died before anyone had told her anything, because she'd read it off Clara's face from across the kitchen. Now she sat in the back of the wagon very still and watched the planes go by, and Clara understood, looking at her, that Lucy had heard what that man in Reeves Crossing said, or something like it. There had been other moments. The woman in Dalton closing the door. The men in Haverford watching with that mixed expression. A child picks up on these things. They don't miss them. Clara climbed into the wagon bed and sat next to her. The others gave them space instinctively, redistributing themselves toward the front. "You feeling sick?" Clara asked. Lucy shook her head. "What then?" A long pause. Lucy picked at a thread on her dress hem. "Mrs. Rankin in Dalton. She looked at us all and then she did this." Lucy pressed her lips together and shook her head slightly, the way you'd do at something that was more than you wanted to deal with. "I saw that too. Do you think she was right? That nobody's going to want us?" Lucy's voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "Because there are a lot of us. Maybe if there was just fewer—" "Stop," Clara said, not harshly, but firmly. "Look at me." Lucy looked. "Every single one of you is exactly who I want. There is no number that would be better. There is no less of you that I would choose." She paused. "Do you understand that?" "But other people are not your mother." Clara put her arm around Lucy's thin shoulders. "Other people are making decisions about what's convenient for them. That's not the same thing as the truth of what you're worth. Not even close." Lucy leaned against her. They rode like that for a while without talking. But Clara knew, sitting there with the wagon swaying and the gray sky spreading out in every direction, that she needed something to change soon. The words she'd said to Lucy were true, but words didn't fill a stomach or keep a cough from getting worse. $31. 2 horses, 9 children, and the horizon offering nothing she could see. That night they camped by a dry creek bed about 6 miles outside a settlement called Grover's Mill, which someone in Reeves Crossing had mentioned in the general direction of possibility. Clara sat up after the children were asleep and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding. At their current rate of spending, they had maybe 9 or 10 days before the money was gone. By then, they'd need to be somewhere with work, or they'd need to find someone willing to extend credit they had no obvious way of repaying, or they'd need to face the kind of options she wasn't ready to put a name to. She'd heard there was a community of settlers somewhere northeast, a place called Adderley, not quite a town yet, more of a collection of families who'd staked out homesteads in proximity and were slowly building something together. Nobody had been entirely clear on how far it was or what conditions were like. It had the quality of rumor rather than fact, but rumors were sometimes the only map you had. Martin appeared from the direction of the horses and sat down across the fire from her. He'd taken on the last watch of the night without anyone asking him to, somewhere around the 3rd day, and he'd done it every night since. He was 14, broad-shouldered like Thomas had been at that age, with Thomas's way of sitting that looked relaxed but was actually quite alert. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." He picked up a stick and turned it between his fingers. "How bad is it?" She thought about protecting him from this and decided against it. He was doing the work of a grown man. He deserved honesty. "We have maybe 10 days of money left. After that, I need to have found work or we're in trouble." He nodded slowly. "There's some game out here. I know you could. That's not a criticism." She had seen him looking at the terrain the way Thomas had looked at it, reading it for what it might provide. "But I don't want that to be what you're doing every day. You're 14. "I know how old I am, Mama." "I know you do." He poked at the fire. A log settled, sending up a brief column of sparks. "Caleb's cough is worse." "I know." "Is it?" "I don't think so. Not yet. I'm watching it." Martin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Papa used to say that the worst thing about hard times was that they felt permanent, that you couldn't see the end of them while you were in them." Clara looked at her eldest son across the fire. When did he say that? When we had that bad winter, 3 years back. When we lost the cattle. Martin's expression was thoughtful, turned inward. He said you just have to keep moving because standing still feels safer, but it isn't. Clara didn't say anything for a moment. The fire crackled. He was right, she said finally. Yeah. Martin set down the stick. I know. Grover's Mill had a store and a blacksmith and a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. It also had a woman named Harriet Fossey who ran the store, and who, unlike everyone else they'd encountered, didn't immediately look at the wagon full of children and close her expression down. Coming from the south? Harriet asked. She was 50 or so, with white hair pinned up under a hat, and the kind of face that had been weathered into something angular and permanent. West of Laramie, Clara said. We're looking for work or a place to winter. We have skills. My oldest boy can work a forge. My daughter can keep books. I can cook or sew or work a field. Harriet had looked at her steadily. What happened? Clara told her the short version. Land syndicate, forged documents, Thomas. Harriet listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Harriet turned and called through the back door of the store. A man came out. Her husband, apparently, thick-armed and quiet. And she repeated what Clara had told her in about 30 seconds. The man looked at Clara. Pinnacle Western? Yes. He made a sound that was not quite a word. They've done that to 3 families I know of in the last 2 years. He looked at his wife. That Alderman family, out past Draper Creek. And the Voss family, Harriet said. There's a place called Adderley, the man said to Clara. Northeast of here, maybe 40 miles. It's not much yet, but there are families there, people building. They'd at least hear you out. Is there work there? He spread his hands. Growing settlement. They need people who work. More than they need people who don't. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the first thing that had sounded like something other than a door closing. Harriet sold her flour and salt pork at cost and wouldn't take the full price Clara tried to give her. Take care of that cough, she said, looking past Clara at Caleb, who was visible in the wagon. Onion poultice on the chest at night if you have onions, or just keep him warm. Thank you, Clara said. She meant it more than the words could hold. Nothing to thank me for, Harriet said, already turning back to something behind the counter. Just people being people. The 40 miles to Adderley took 2.5 days. The terrain was harder going, rising ground with more rock and less of the flat brown grass that had characterized the earlier stretch. Pearl developed a stone bruise on her right forefoot on the second day, not serious, but enough to slow them. Clara walked to spare the horse weight, and Eliza walked beside her, and they talked for the first time since leaving home about something other than immediate logistics. Were you and Papa happy? Eliza asked at one point. Clara looked at her. What kind of question is that? An honest one. Clara considered it seriously, the way Eliza's questions generally required. Yes, not always easy. Sometimes we were too tired to be kind to each other. Sometimes we disagreed badly. But yes, we were happy. Eliza walked in silence for a moment. I never really thought about whether you were happy or not. I just thought you were Mama and Papa, not people with a happiness to have. Children never do, Clara said. It's all right. You're thinking about it now. I'm thinking that I don't know how you're doing this. Eliza said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things. I'm 16 and I can barely hold myself together, and you just keep going. I'm not holding together especially well on the inside, Clara said. I just can't afford to show it right now. That seems exhausting. It is, Clara said. It really is. Eliza slipped her hand into Clara's as they walked. She hadn't done that since she was maybe 9 years old. Clara didn't comment on it, just held on. But the first sight of Adderley was unpromising. A cluster of structures that ranged from solid to barely standing spread across a shallow valley that at least had water running through it. A proper creek, not a dry bed. Some fields that had been worked with the stubble of a harvest still visible. A few buildings that suggested permanence. A few that suggested optimism. And roads, actual roads, not just wagon tracks. Somebody had put work into this. A man on horseback met them at the edge of the settlement. A lean fellow with a sun-darkened face and the watchful look of someone who'd learned to assess strangers quickly. He looked at the wagon, looked at Clara on Pearl, looked at the children. Help you? He said. We're looking for work, possibly winter shelter. We've come from west of Laramie. Clara had her explanation down to its essentials now. My name is Clara Whitmore. These are my children. The man looked at the wagon again. How many? 9. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair and put the hat back on. 9. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my name's Chester Rowe. I'm sort of the unofficial, well, nobody gave me a title, but I end up talking to newcomers. He looked at the wagon again, then back at her. You look like you've been on the road a while. 5 days. Come on then, let's get that horse out of service. He'd noticed Pearl's careful step. We can talk about the rest once everyone's had water and something hot. It wasn't welcome exactly. It wasn't even warmth, but it was the first time in 5 days that no door had been closed before she finished speaking, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen very slightly. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope, which was at least a direction. Adderley had 70-some residents, most of them families, several of them single men who'd staked claims and were working them. Chester Rowe had explained all of this over a pot of something that called itself stew, while her children ate with the focused efficiency of people who'd been doing with less than they needed for several days. There was work. Not a lot, but some. There was a woman who'd been doing the settlement's laundry herself and was behind. There was a man whose wife had died that summer and who had 2 children of his own and couldn't manage the cooking and the fields at the same time. There was a fence line that needed building before spring. None of it added up to what they needed, not quite, but it added up to something. What it didn't add up to was a place to sleep. The settlement's spare structures were not numerous, and the one available space was a partially finished building that had no insulation, no stove, and gaps in the wallboards that the coming winter would not be kind about. It's what we have, Chester said, not unkindly. It'll do for now, Clara said, because that was what she had. She was lying, and she knew it, and she thought Chester probably knew it too, but he had the grace not to say so. That night, with the children settled in the unfinished building under every quilt they owned, Clara sat outside on a section of fence timber and looked at the stars coming through the cold, clear air and let herself feel for just a moment how tired she was. Not just the physical tired, though that was real enough. Her feet ached and her back had developed a low grinding pain that appeared each morning and didn't leave until she'd been moving for an hour. The other tired. The tired that came from being the person everyone looked at for answers, every hour of every day, in a situation that didn't have answers yet. She was 37 years old. She had 9 children and $31. No, 24 now, after Grover's Mill. And 2 horses, one of them lame, and a dead husband who was the person she would have talked to about all of this. She had landed in a settlement that was not unwelcoming but was not able to save her, in a building that was going to get very cold very fast. She allowed herself exactly the length of time it took the stars to shift perceptibly in the sky to feel all of this without doing anything about it. To feel it completely, without looking away. Then she pulled Thomas's coat tighter around her shoulders. She'd taken it because it was warmer than her own, and because it still smelled faintly like him, which she was not going to think about right now. And she started making the next list. What she needed, what she had, the gap between them, how to close it. She didn't know yet about the ranch 10 miles north of Adderley. She didn't know about the man who lived there alone, who would be in town in 2 days to collect supplies, who would see the wagon and the children and make a decision that was either foolish or decent, depending on how you looked at it. She didn't know any of that. She just knew she was still moving, and for tonight, that was enough. The stars moved overhead, cold and indifferent and very far away, and Clara Whitmore made her list. Gideon Cross came into Adderley on a Tuesday, which Clara knew only because Chester Rowe had mentioned the supply wagon came through on Tuesdays and Fridays, and she'd been counting days the way you count money when there's not enough of it, carefully, with full attention to what each one cost. She was hanging laundry outside the unfinished building when she heard the wagon. Not their wagon. A different one, heavier, with a team of 2 solid-looking bays that moved with the unhurried confidence of horses that were well-fed and well-handled. The man driving it was lean in the shoulders and sat straight without looking stiff, the way some men who'd spent years on horseback sat even when they weren't on a horse. She noticed him the way you notice weather coming, not with particular interest, just an automatic reading of what was in the environment. She went back to the laundry. She was aware, peripherally, of him tying the team at Chester Rowe's store and going inside. She was aware of May appearing from around the side of the building and planning herself approximately 10 feet from the strange wagon to stare at the horses with the focused intensity that 5-year-olds brought to things that interested them. She was aware of Ruth appearing behind May a moment later and taking her hand without saying anything, the two of them standing there looking at the horses together. What she was not aware of was the exact moment the man came out of the store and stopped. She became aware of it when Chester Rowe's voice carried across the yard. "That's the Whitmore family. Came in 3 days ago." She turned. The man from the wagon was standing at the edge of the store's porch, looking at May and Ruth, looking at his horses. His expression was, she wasn't sure. Not the compressed lip look she'd gotten in Haverford. Not the closed-door look from Dalton. Just looking, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. May, without any apparent awareness that staring at a stranger's horses might require explanation, turned and said, "Your horses are very big." "They are," the man said. His voice was even, not particularly warm, but not cold either. "You want to pet one?" May looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the man, making her own assessment, then looked over at Clara. Clara gave the slight nod that meant use your judgment, and Ruth looked back at the man and said, "Yes, please." He walked over and put May's small hand against the nearest horse's nose and let her feel the velvet of it. The horse blew out a breath which May found enormously funny. Clara finished pinning the sheet she was holding and walked over. "Clara Whitmore," she said. He looked at her. He was maybe 40, with a face that had been lived in. Not handsome exactly, or not in any uncomplicated way, but the kind of face that had gone through enough that what was left was what was actually there. A scar along his jawline, old and faded, gray coming in at his temples, eyes that were a dark brown and direct without being aggressive. "Gideon Cross," he said. "I run a spread about 10 miles north." "Alone?" "Mostly." He looked at the unfinished building behind her, then at the laundry, then at the general evidence of a family and temporary residence. "Chester says you've been here 3 days." "Yes." "You looking for permanent work or just winter shelter?" Clara looked at him steadily. She'd gotten very good in the past week at reading the sub-question underneath the question, the thing people were really asking when they asked about her situation. Most of the time it was some version of, "How much of a problem are you going to be?" But this man's face wasn't doing that. He seemed to be asking exactly what he'd asked. Both, ideally, she said. Work that becomes something permanent, or at least through the winter with the possibility of something more. "How many children?" 9. He didn't flinch, and he didn't make the face, and he didn't put his hat back on and wish her luck. He just nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they're filing information rather than reacting to it. "I've got a bunkhouse that's sitting empty," he said, "and a main house kitchen that nobody's cooked in properly for about 8 months. My fence line needs work before spring, and I'm short-handed going into the cold months." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'd need real work in return. But if you're willing to work, there's room." Clara looked at him for a long moment. In her experience, offers that came this easily generally had a shape you didn't see until you were already inside them. "What do you want in return exactly? Cooking, cleaning, help with whatever needs doing on the property, your older boys on the fence line, and any other labor that comes up. Honest work for honest shelter." He said it plainly, without any particular emphasis on the fairness of it, as if he were describing a transaction rather than doing something generous. "I'm not running a charity, and I'm not running anything other than a cattle operation that needs more hands than I've got. And you're not—" She stopped and started again. "I want to be clear about the nature of what you're offering." He understood what she meant. His expression didn't change. "Room and wages for a family that needs work," he said. Nothing else. She believed him, which was its own kind of surprise. She couldn't have said exactly why, except that liars generally try harder than this. They add things. They reassure more than the situation requires. This man had simply stated terms. "I need to talk to my oldest too," she said. "All right." She went to find Martin and Eliza. Martin's reaction was the one she'd expected, measured, thorough, skeptical, in a way that wasn't hostile but was careful. He asked how far the ranch was, what the bunkhouse conditions were like, whether there were neighbors, whether the man had a reputation she could check. She answered what she knew and said she didn't know the rest yet. "What does he want with a widow and 9 kids?" Martin asked. Not mean, genuinely trying to understand the logic of it. "He says he needs labor. He could hire men. Men cost more than he'd be paying us, most likely." Martin thought about this. "That's true," he admitted. Eliza's reaction was faster and less comfortable to hear. "He seems decent," she said, and then more quietly, "And we can't stay in that building through winter, Mama. I've been looking at those wall gaps." "I know." Caleb's cough. "I know, Eliza." Eliza met her eyes. "I think you should say yes. I think we don't have the option of being careful right now, and I think this man seems like an honest offer." "You decided that from watching him let May pet his horse for 2 minutes?" "I decided it from watching how he looked at you when you told him 9 children. Eliza shrugged. People can't fake their first reaction. His first reaction was to keep listening. Claire considered that. It was the kind of observation that was annoyingly accurate. She went back to Gideon Cross. "We'll come," she said. He nodded. "I'll have the bunkhouse ready by Thursday." Chut. The Cross Ranch sat in a wide natural bowl in the land, sheltered on the north and west by a ridge that wasn't quite high enough to be called a hill, but broke the worst of the wind. It had a main house built solid, real lumber, not the half-green timber that fell apart in its second winter, a barn that was larger than the house, the bunkhouse Chester had mentioned, and a collection of smaller outbuildings in various states of maintenance. There was a creek along the eastern edge of the property that ran clear even this late in the season, with ice forming at the edges in the mornings but the center still moving. The land itself was good. Clara could see it even from the wagon, driving in. The grass had been managed, not just grazed down to dust. The fence lines that were standing properly. The things that were falling apart in the way things fall apart when one man runs out of hours in the day, not in the way things fall apart from neglect. Gideon Cross was a man who'd been trying to keep up with a property that needed more people than he had. The bunkhouse had 4 rooms, which was not enough for 9 children, and their mother, in any configuration that offered privacy, but was considerably more than what they'd had for the past week. There were actual stoves, not large, but functional. There was a table. The walls were solid. May walked in, looked around, and said, "This is good," with the authority of someone who had decided. Henry said, "It smells like horses." "Everything smells like horses," Horace said. "It smells like horses more than usual." This was accurate. Clara opened the windows anyway, and the twins carried in the bedrolls, and Ruth organized May and Lucy in a corner they claimed immediately as their domain, and Martin and Eliza and Caleb began sorting through what needed to go where, and Daniel appeared with firewood he'd found in the pile outside before anyone thought to ask him to. Clara stood in the middle of all of it and watched her family fill up a space, and felt something that was not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. The first meal she cooked in Gideon's kitchen was a practical assessment disguised as dinner. She wanted to know what he had, what he was used to eating, what the kitchen could do. What he had was more than she'd expected: a root cellar with decent stores, smoked meat hanging in the barn, dried beans and cornmeal and flour, an apple barrel that was still mostly full. What he was used to eating, she quickly gathered, was whatever was fastest, the evidence of a man who cooked to survive rather than cooked to eat. The kind of meals that were not bad exactly, but had lost any ambition about 6 months ago. She made salt pork and beans and cornbread and a pot of apples, something that used the bruised ones from the bottom of the barrel, and Gideon Cross ate all of it without commenting, except to say, halfway through, "This is better than what I've been managing." "That's a low bar," Eliza said from the other end of the table. Martin looked at her sharply. Clara suppressed whatever her own expression was doing. But Gideon Cross made a sound that was almost a laugh. "It is," he agreed. Eliza looked slightly surprised that this had worked out. The children ate. Clara observed who Gideon Cross was at his own table, which was different from who he was in a public space. He didn't talk much, but he listened. She could see it, the quality of attention he gave when someone spoke. He answered questions directly and without performing patience, which was its own kind of patience. When Henry knocked over his water cup and went rigid with the anticipatory horror of having done something wrong around a stranger in his house, Gideon just reached over, righted the cup, and said, "Happens," and went back to eating. Henry looked at Horace. Horace looked back. Something passed between the 8-year-olds that Clara couldn't fully read, but which seemed to be along the lines of, "This one might be all right." The work began immediately and was genuinely work, which Clara had expected and did not mind. She was up before the children, had the kitchen fire going and water heating before Gideon came in from whatever he did first thing in the mornings. She gathered it involved the horses, since he always smelled like hay and cold air when he came through the door. She cooked breakfast. He ate. He told her what he needed done that day in brief, matter-of-fact terms, the way you'd tell someone competent rather than someone you were managing. She appreciated that more than she could say. Martin and Caleb's cough was improving with the warmth, which Clara noted with quiet relief. Worked the fence line with Gideon in the mornings. James, at 12, took on the barn, feeding, mucking, the basic daily labor that a barn requires just to stay functional. Daniel kept the wood stacked, the water hauled, and appeared wherever there was something small and necessary being ignored, addressing it without comment. Eliza ran the household budget that Clara had asked her to track. Ruth managed the younger ones during the hours the older children were working, with a firm and mostly cheerful authority that surprised nobody who knew her. Lucy had started eating again, which Clara had been watching for like watching for a change in weather. May, age 5, contributed by being May, which, it turned out, included attaching herself to Gideon Cross with a persistence that bordered on professional. It started on the second day. He was crossing the yard and she fell into step beside him as if this had been arranged. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Check on the mare in the north paddock." "Can I come?" He'd looked down at her. "You'll have to keep up." "I can keep up." He'd walked and she'd kept up, trotting slightly at his longer stride, and he'd checked on the mare with May narrating her observations about the horse in real time, and he'd answered her questions with the same flat brevity he used with adults, which she seemed to find perfectly satisfactory. This became a pattern. When Gideon moved through the property, May appeared. He never told her to go away. Clara watched this from a careful distance and tried to decide what she thought about it and arrived at no clear conclusion. The trouble started, as trouble often does, not with a single event, but with a current that had been running underneath things all along. It was Chester Rowe who brought the first news, riding out to the ranch on a gray morning about 2 weeks in, wearing an expression Clara had already learned to read as meaning something uncomfortable was coming. He accepted coffee from Clara at the kitchen table while Gideon stood near the door with his arms crossed and the look of a man who knew whatever Chester was about to say. "People in Adderley are talking," Chester said. He had the directness of someone who'd decided the kindest thing was to just say it. "About the arrangement here. Some people think it's—" He paused, choosing "not suitable." "Not suitable," Gideon repeated. "A widow with 9 children living on a single man's property." Chester spread his hands. "You know how people get." "I know how some people get," Gideon said. "There's also talk coming in from the east, from Millfield and Holt's Crossing. Some men came through last week asking about a widow named Whitmore." Chester looked at Clara now. They weren't asking in a friendly way. Clara set down her cup. The tin made a sound on the table that was louder than she'd intended. "What were they asking?" "Whether anyone had seen you, what direction you'd gone." He paused. "One of them was named Pruitt." She felt the name like something cold passing through the room. Martin, who'd come in for water and had been standing very still by the sink for the last 30 seconds, looked at her. She looked back at him. "What did you tell them?" she asked Chester. "Told them I'd seen a lot of wagons come through. Didn't know any Whitmores." Chester met her eyes. "That was 2 weeks ago. I didn't know about you then. You came in the day after. I'm telling you now because if they circle back, someone else might be more helpful than I was." Gideon hadn't moved from his spot by the door. "What's Pruitt's connection to the land syndicate?" "He works for them," Clara said. "He was the foreman the day they came to our property. He was there when Thomas was shot." The words sat in the room. Chester looked at his coffee. Gideon looked at Clara with the same direct brown gaze he'd had the first day, but something behind it had shifted slightly. They're making sure you can't file a complaint, Gideon said. If you don't know where to go, you can't cause them problems. That would be my reading, Clara said. Do you have anything? Gideon asked. Evidence of any kind? She thought about the eviction notice in her coat, which she had not taken out since the night she'd read it. She thought about what else she'd managed to bring out of the house in the dark before Pruitt's men came back. Documents Thomas had kept in the locked box under the floorboards, which she'd opened with the spare key Thomas had always kept on a hook behind the stove. She hadn't looked at the documents since. She'd been too occupied with survival to think about what came after it. I might, she said carefully. I need to look at some papers I brought with me. Chester nodded and stood. I'd be quiet about it, whatever you do. Pinnacle Western has long arms in this part of the territory. They've got people in county offices. I know, Clara said. After he left, she and Gideon sat in the kitchen for a few minutes without talking. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, she could hear the twins arguing about something, and Ruth's voice, patient and firm, interceding. They're going to find you eventually, Gideon said. You know that. Yes. What do you want to do about it? She looked at him. I want to look at those documents, and then I want to figure out who in this territory is honest enough to show them to. That's a short list, he said. I know. Help me make it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he'd nodded when she'd said they'd come to his ranch, filing it away, agreeing, moving to the next thing. I'll think on it, he said, and got up to go back to work. She found the documents that night when the children were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. She'd brought the leather satchel from the bottom of the clothing box where she'd packed it, and she laid everything out on the table with the care of someone handling something fragile, even though the papers themselves were not fragile. They were the stiff, official kind, the kind that were meant to convey permanence. There were 7 documents. 3 were things she'd known about: the original homestead filing, the deed in Thomas's name, and a letter from the county recorder dated 6 years ago confirming the boundaries of their claim. Those she'd expected. The other 4 she had not looked at closely before. Thomas had kept them in the locked box without telling her why. He'd been, in certain practical matters, a man who handled things himself without explaining why he was handling them, which had been occasionally frustrating and was now, sitting at this table, something she couldn't quite feel any particular way about. The 4th document was a survey map. She didn't have the expertise to read a survey map in detail, but she could read enough to understand that it showed the Whitmore property boundaries and that there was a notation in the corner, a date and initials that were not the same as the county recorder mentioned in the eviction notice. The 5th document was a letter, handwritten, from someone named Aldous Vane, addressed to Thomas. She read it 3 times. It described a conversation Vane had had with a man from Pinnacle Western Development Company, a conversation in which the company representative had outlined their intention to file a survey dispute on several properties in the region, including the Whitmore homestead. The letter was dated almost 2 years before Pruitt's men had come to their yard. Thomas had known this was coming. She sat with that for a moment. The 6th document was Thomas's own handwriting. Notes, the cramped and precise notes he'd made when he was working out a problem, covering 3 pages. She had to read them slowly to follow his thinking. He'd been tracking the land syndicate's acquisitions. He'd identified 9 properties they'd claimed using similar methods over 3 years. He'd noted names: the foreman Pruitt, a county official named Bassett, a lawyer in Millfield named Corey Jacks, and above them, a name she hadn't heard before: Harland Muse. She didn't know who Harland Muse was, but Thomas had written the name with a different kind of deliberateness than the others, underlined twice. The 7th document was the most important. It was a witness statement signed by 2 men she didn't know, describing the methods Pinnacle Western used to manufacture survey disputes. It was the kind of document that required someone with legal standing to make useful. It wasn't enough by itself. But it was the kind of document that, in the right hands, became the beginning of something. Thomas had been building a case. He'd been building it quietly, without telling her, probably because he hadn't wanted to worry her. Probably because he'd thought he had more time. He hadn't had more time. Clara sat at the table for a long while after she finished reading. The lamp guttered once, and she turned it up. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the eaves of the house the way wind does in autumn, testing what was solid and what wasn't. She thought about Thomas at his own table, by his own lamp, making these notes, tracking these names. building something careful and methodical with his large, practical hands. She thought about him looking up at her across the kitchen and choosing not to say anything yet, waiting until it was ready. She put everything back in the satchel. She set it on the table in front of her. Then she sat in the quiet kitchen of a man she'd known 3 weeks and felt the full weight of what her husband had left her. So not just children, not just debt and loss and an empty house, but this. A half-built case against the men who'd stolen everything. And the question of whether she had the knowledge and the will and the contacts to finish it. The answer to the last part she already knew. She had the will. She'd had it since the day she stood in the yard with Pruitt's men around her and folded that eviction notice against her chest. The knowledge and the contacts were what she was going to need help with. What? She told Gideon the following morning. She laid the documents out on the kitchen table, the same way she'd laid them out the night before, and walked him through what each one was and what she thought it meant. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his eyes moving across the papers. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. "Your husband put this together himself?" he said finally. "It appears so. Without a lawyer." Thomas was thorough, she said. He didn't trust lawyers much. Gideon made a sound that might have been agreement. "This name, Harlan Muse," he pointed at Thomas's notes. "I've heard that name." She looked at him. "Who is he?" "If it's the same man, and I think it is, he's the money behind Pinnacle Western. He doesn't have his name on anything official. He operates through other men, through companies. But people in the cattle business hear things." Gideon picked up Thomas's notes and read them again, more slowly. "If your husband identified him, that's significant. That's not something they're going to want made public. Which is why Pruitt is looking for me." "Yes." He set the notes back down. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't quite seen before. Not the careful neutrality he generally maintained, but something more engaged. Something that looked like anger on her behalf, kept under careful control. "What do you need?" "A lawyer," she said. "An honest one, which I understand is a short list. And someone who can tell me who in the territorial government isn't connected to these men." "I know someone," he said after a pause. "Fort Laramie, a man named Harwick. He was a circuit judge before he retired. He has no connection to the land companies. He had a long argument with them about 20 years ago, and he's been particular about it ever since." He paused. "He's not easy to deal with. He's old and he's difficult, and he has opinions about everything. But he's honest? In my experience, yes." "That's enough," Clara said. The first sign that their presence on the ranch was becoming something more complicated than a work arrangement came on a Saturday, when 2 men Clara didn't know rode onto the property and asked for Gideon. He came out of the barn. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, close enough to hear but back far enough that she wasn't obviously there. The men were from Millfield, they said. They'd heard Gideon had taken on some workers. They'd heard it was a widow woman with a lot of children, and they wanted him to know that some folks in the area had concerns about the arrangement, about the impression it gave, about the kind of talk it generated. They said this in the polite tone that men use when they're delivering a threat and want to be able to say later that they were just sharing information. Gideon listened to all of it without any particular expression. When they finished, he said, "I appreciate you riding out." They waited for something more. "That's it," Gideon said. "I appreciate you riding out. Safe trip home." One of them opened his mouth to say something else. Gideon looked at him, and whatever the man had been about to say didn't get said. They rode away. Gideon came back inside. "That'll happen again," Clara said. "Probably. You don't have to. You didn't agree to this kind of trouble when you offered us work." He looked at her with an expression that suggested this was a strange thing to say. "What kind of trouble did you think I agreed to?" She didn't have an answer for that. "Go back to what you were doing," he said, not unkindly, and went back to the barn. She stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment and then went back to what she was doing. But she was thinking about that exchange, about the quality of his refusal to be moved, the complete absence of drama in it. She'd known men who were stubborn, but it was usually a loud stubbornness, a stubbornness that wanted to be witnessed. His was different. It was the kind that didn't need an audience. She thought about what kind of man that made him. She thought about what it meant that she was starting to think about what kind of man he was. And then she stopped thinking about it because there were beans on the stove and 3 children who needed their hair washed and a set of documents she needed to keep safe until she figured out what to do with them. That was enough for one day. What Clara didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the men from Millfield had not come on their own initiative. They had come because someone had sent them, and the person who'd sent them had a clearer picture of where Clara Whitmore was and what she might be carrying than she'd realized. The cold was settling in earnest now. The creek along the eastern edge of the ranch was freezing over at night, cracking and groaning in the early mornings with the sound of something old being broken open. The ridge to the north and west was doing its job with the wind, but the temperature was dropping to places that made outdoor work brutal by mid-afternoon. The children adapted in the way children do, which is to say inconsistently, loudly, and with occasional moments of grace that caught Clara off guard. One evening she came into the bunkhouse to find Gideon sitting on the floor of the main room with a broken bridle in his lap and 3 of the younger children arranged around him, watching him repair it with the stitching awl he'd brought in from the barn. He was explaining what he was doing in the brief, practical way he explained most things. And Lucy who'd stopped eating, Lucy who'd been so quiet since Reeves Crossing, was asking questions in a voice Clara hadn't heard her use in weeks. A normal voice. A curious voice. Clara stopped in the doorway and didn't say anything. After a moment, she backed out quietly. She stood outside in the cold for a while, leaning against the bunkhouse wall, feeling the cold bite of the air and the strange, complicated thing that was happening in her chest, which was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it in the way that some kinds of relief are. Too much arriving at once, more than you know what to do with. She stayed until the cold made her fingers hurt. Then she went back inside. The bridle was repaired. Lucy was holding it, turning it over in her hands, looking at the stitching with something that was almost wonder. Gideon looked up when Clara came in. Their eyes met for a second, and then both of them looked away, in the way of 2 people who have both noticed the same thing and mutually agreed not to make anything of it. Outside, the creek cracked and groaned in the dark. Inside, there was lamplight and children's voices and the smell of wood smoke, and something that was not yet a home, but was becoming something, the way things become what they're going to be. Slowly, without anyone deciding it, just one day after another, until you look around and find yourself somewhere you hadn't planned to be. The first hard frost came on a Wednesday, coating everything in a white that looked clean from a distance and was brutal up close. The creek along the eastern edge of the ranch stopped its nighttime groaning and simply locked, a solid skin of ice from bank to bank by morning, thick enough to walk on at the edges, though none of them tested it because the center was still running dark and fast beneath the surface, moving the way water moves when it has somewhere urgent to be. Gideon had predicted it. He'd spent the 2 days before laying in extra wood and checking the bunkhouse stoves with the methodical attention of a man who'd been through enough Wyoming winters to know that the first hard freeze was a kind of announcement. Everything that came after it would be more serious than what came before. Clara had spent those same 2 days going through Thomas's documents again, this time with a more specific purpose. She'd made her own notes, in the margins of a piece of brown paper she'd found in the kitchen, organizing what they had by type. What was first-hand evidence? What was circumstantial? What was hearsay that might still be useful in front of the right person? It was the kind of work that required a particular quality of concentration, and she'd done most of it late at night when the children were asleep and the house had the particular stillness of a place that's holding its breath. She'd shown her notes to Gideon on Tuesday evening. He'd read them at the kitchen table while she washed up the supper dishes, and when he finished, he'd said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Women don't get to be lawyers," she said. "I'm aware." He'd set the notes down. "I'm writing to Harwick tomorrow. I'll ask him to come out or to receive us." "How long will that take?" "Depends on the weather and whether he's feeling cooperative. Could be 2 weeks, could be a month." He'd looked at the notes again. "This is good work, Clara." She'd been standing at the sink and she'd kept her hands in the water and said, "Thank you," in a voice she'd managed to keep even, because the simple fact of someone saying that, someone noticing the quality of what she'd done, not to be kind but because it was accurate, had hit somewhere she hadn't expected. After he'd gone to bed, she'd stood at the window for a while, looking out at the frozen dark, and thought about the distance between where she'd been 2 months ago and where she was now. The distance was enormous. She still couldn't fully see where she was going, but she was moving toward something rather than just away from everything, which was different in a way that mattered. Martin came to her the following Saturday morning with the look he wore when he had something he'd been sitting on for a few days. She was in the root cellar taking inventory when she heard him on the steps. She waited. "There were men in Adderley yesterday," he said from the bottom step. "I went in with Chester for feed, and I heard them, 2 of them, asking at the store." Clara set down the jar she was holding. "Asking about us?" "About you specifically. About whether anyone knew a widow named Whitmore with 9 kids who'd come through recently." He paused. "The storekeeper, not Chester, the other man, Tibbs, he didn't say anything, but Martin said there was a 3rd man who came in later, someone he didn't know, and that man went and talked to the other 2 outside after." "Did you recognize any of them?" "No, but one of them had a red beard." She picked up the jar again and set it with the others, not because she'd finished counting, but because she needed to do something with her hands. "Pruitt." Of course it was Pruitt, the man with the red beard and the pale eyes, and the receipt-like manner of delivering devastating news. "You didn't let them see you?" "No, I went around the back of the store and came out on the other side." He was quiet for a moment. "Mama, how close are they?" "Close enough that we need to move faster than I'd planned." She finished the inventory in her head rather than on paper and came up the cellar steps, brushing dust from her hands. "I'm going to talk to Gideon today." "He's not going to like it," Martin said. "I know. Not because he'll want us to leave," Martin said it carefully, "because he'll want to do something about it, and there might not be much to do yet." She looked at her son, 14 years old, reading the situation with the precision of someone twice his age, and felt the familiar twin pull of pride and worry that was simply the condition of being his mother. "You're probably right," she said. "Come inside, Ishat." See, Gideon's reaction was not quite what Martin had predicted. He didn't want to do something immediately, which was what Clara had half expected. What he did instead was go quiet in the particular way he went quiet when he was thinking, leaning against the kitchen counter with his coffee gone cold and his eyes somewhere between here and wherever his mind was working. "He's circling," Gideon said finally. "Yes. He's not ready to move yet, or he'd have moved. He's trying to find out what you have before he decides how to come at you." He looked at the satchel on the table. Clara had brought it out when she came to talk to him, some instinct making her want it visible and accounted for. "Those documents are what he's worried about, not you personally, what you're carrying." "Thomas's notes specifically," Clara said. "If they name Harlan Muse, that's what they need back. Or destroyed." Gideon set down his cup. "We need to get copies made. Before anything else, we need those documents to exist in more than one place." "Where?" "Chester. And Harwick, when we reach him. And—" He stopped, working through something. "There's a land office in Fort Laramie, a federal office, not a territorial one. If we can get copies filed there, it becomes much harder for anyone to make them disappear, because now there'd have to be a reason to explain why someone was interfering with a federal land office filing." Clara looked at him. "You've thought about this kind of thing before." "I've had reasons to." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask, because there was a quality to that statement that indicated it came from somewhere personal and was not being offered for sharing. What he said next, she hadn't expected. "I'm going to ask Chester to start quietly talking to people. There are other families in this area who've had trouble with Pinnacle Western. Chester mentioned the Alderman family, the Voss family. If those families still have documentation, or if they're willing to testify, it stops being one widow's complaint," Clara said, "and becomes something that requires a federal response." He met her eyes. "It's slower, but it's the kind of thing that actually works." She thought about Thomas's notes. 9 properties, 3 years of acquisitions, a pattern of manufactured survey disputes. Thomas had seen the same thing. He'd been building toward the same conclusion. He just hadn't had the time or the contacts to get there. "All right," she said. "How do we start?" The copies took 3 days to make. Eliza had the best handwriting of anyone in the family, precise and clear, in the way of someone who'd been the household bookkeeper since she was 12. Clara sat with her and read each document aloud while Eliza transcribed, checking each page against the original before moving to the next. It was slow, painstaking work, and by the end of the second day, Eliza's hand was cramping and Clara's voice had gone rough from reading. "This one," Eliza said, on the third day, tapping Thomas's notes. She'd been working steadily and quietly all morning, but there was something in her voice now. "He knew for almost 2 years. Yes. He knew they were coming for the land, and he didn't tell you." Clara chose her words. "He was trying to handle it before it became a crisis. That's how he did things." "It became a crisis anyway." "Yes, it did." Eliza pressed her lips together and looked down at the page. Her handwriting had gone slightly less steady in the last few minutes. "I'm not angry at him," she said, in a voice that suggested she was, a little, or something adjacent to anger. That particular feeling of loving someone who made choices you couldn't undo and couldn't argue with anymore. "I know," Clara said. "It's just—" Eliza stopped. "I know," Clara said again, more quietly. They finished the copies without talking much after that. Sometimes the work of grief was this: sitting next to someone in a room, doing something with your hands, letting the feeling move through you without making it into more than it was. The trouble came on a Thursday, 12 days after Martin's report from Adderley, and it did not come in the form Clara had been watching for. She'd been watching the road. She'd been watching for red beards and legal papers and the particular quality of official threat that Pruitt represented. She'd been sleeping lightly, keeping the satchel under her mattress, running through contingencies in the last minutes before she fell asleep and the first minutes after she woke. She was not watching the creek. It had rained for 3 days. A late-season rain, cold and heavy, the kind that turns the ground to mud and swells every water source past its usual margins. The creek along the eastern edge of the ranch had climbed its banks and was moving fast, brown and churning, carrying debris. Gideon had told the children twice to stay away from it. Clara had told them once in the tone that did not need repetition. The twins were 8 years old, and the thing about 8-year-olds is that they hear instructions and believe they have fully processed them, and then an hour later they are standing somewhere they were told not to stand, with complete sincerity about how they arrived there. She heard Ruth shouting first. Not the annoyed shout of an older sister managing younger children. The other kind, the sharp and rising kind that meant something was wrong. Clara was out the door before the thought was complete. What she saw, coming around the side of the bunkhouse. The creek, high and brown and moving fast, and Henry standing at its edge on the bank, and Horace in the water. Not in it by choice. Horace was in the water the way you're in something when it has you. Flailing, going under and coming up, his mouth open, but the sound he was making barely audible over the water. He'd gone in at the bend where the bank dropped off suddenly, where the current was fastest, where the water was deep enough and moving hard enough to take a child and carry him. Ruth was on the bank, screaming his name. Henry had gone rigid, 10 feet back from the edge, one hand over his mouth. Clara ran. She did not think about running. She was simply running. And then she was at the bank and the water was right there and she was trying to read the current and where Horace was going and whether she could... Gideon went past her. He was in the water before she could process that he'd come from the barn, that he'd heard Ruth too, that he'd crossed the yard faster than she had because he'd been closer. He went in his boots and coat, which she registered as a mistake, and then understood he hadn't had time to think about mistakes. He'd just gone in. The water took him too, partially. He went under at the same bend, came up moving fast, and she could see him fighting the current with his arms, not panicking, working. Swimming was not the right word for what you did in a current like that. It was more like negotiating, finding the angles, using the energy of the water rather than fighting it straight on. Horace had caught on something, a branch or debris along the far bank, and was holding there, barely, his face white and his eyes very large. It took Gideon 40 seconds to reach him. Clara counted without meaning to, each second distinct and separate and very long. He got his arm around Horace and worked them both toward the bank, using the same angled swimming, and Clara was moving along the bank, matching their progress downstream. And Martin appeared beside her with a rope she didn't know he'd gone to get, and threw one end toward Gideon with a precision that spoke to hours of practice at something, though she'd never seen him do anything like this before. Gideon caught it. They came out of the water 20 feet downstream from where they'd gone in. Gideon pulling himself up the bank with one arm while the other held Horace, Martin hauling back on the rope. Clara was there when they cleared the bank. She took Horace out of Gideon's arms and held him while he coughed water and shook and cried. Hard, scared crying, the kind that happens after, when the body finally understands what the mind has been too busy surviving to process. She was holding Horace, and she was looking at Gideon. He was on his hands and knees on the bank, his coat soaked through, his breathing hard and uneven. He had a cut on his forehead she hadn't seen him get. From the branch, or from the debris, she didn't know. He was shaking with cold. "You're cut," she said. "I'm fine," he said, which was what people said when they were not fine but intended to be shortly. He got up. His legs were unsteady for a moment and then steadied. He looked at Horace in Clara's arms, and his expression did something complicated that he immediately brought back under control. "Take him inside," he said. "You need to come inside too," she said. "You need dry clothes and you need that cut looked at." "In a minute. Gideon." She said his name, which was the first time she'd said it with that particular quality. Not sharp, not ordering, but the way you say someone's name when you need them to actually hear you. "Come inside now." He looked at her. Something about having his name said that way seemed to reach him in a place that the practical argument hadn't. He came inside. She got Horace dry and into bed with every quilt she could find, shaking but no longer crying, holding May's hand while May patted him with the solemn and focused attention of a 5-year-old performing the only comfort she knew how to give. Ruth sat at the foot of the bed looking pale and composed in the way of someone who had frightened themselves badly and was not going to show it any more than they already had. Henry had not spoken since before the creek. Clara found him sitting outside the bunkhouse door when she came to find Gideon, his knees up and his face hidden against them. She sat next to him on the cold wood. She didn't say anything right away. "I told him we should look," Henry said, muffled. "I said we should just look. I didn't think he'd—" "I know. I should have grabbed him. When I saw him slipping, I should have grabbed him, but I couldn't move." "That happens," Clara said. "When we're scared, sometimes we freeze. That's not a failing in you. That's just how bodies work sometimes." Henry looked up at her. His eyes were red. "Is Horace going to be all right?" "Yes, he's warming up, and he's going to be all right." "Is Mr. Cross—" Henry stopped. "He's all right, too." She put her arm around her son. "Henry, your brother's alive. Mr. Cross is alive. What happened today was very frightening and very close, and it's all right that you're frightened, but everyone came out." Henry pressed against her side, which he generally considered himself too old to do. She let him. Inside the main house, she found Gideon at the kitchen table with his wet coat off and a blanket around his shoulders that someone had put there. Eliza, probably. The cut on his forehead had been cleaned and was not as bad as the blood had made it look, which was usually how it went with head cuts. Eliza had left a cloth and a basin of water on the table. He looked like a man who had been through something and was now sitting very still in the aftermath, the way you sit when the adrenaline is leaving and your body is reminding you of what you just did. Clara sat across from him. "Thank you," she said. "You would have gone in after him," he said. "Yes, but you got there first." He looked at his hands on the table. There were abrasions on his palms from the bank or the rope or both. "He's going to be fine? He's warming up. He'll have a story to tell for the rest of his life." Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of where one might go if he let it. "Kids survive things." "They do." She paused. "You didn't think. You just went in." "There wasn't time to think." "No." She was looking at him steadily. "That's what I mean." He met her eyes. The kitchen was quiet around them. The fire in the stove, the sound of wind at the window, something dripping from the wet coat hung by the door. There was something she wanted to say that she didn't have exact words for. It had been building for weeks, probably. This awareness of who Gideon Cross was, built not from anything he'd announced about himself, but from what she'd watched him do in ordinary moments. The way he'd righted Henry's water cup without comment. The way he'd sat on the floor with Lucy and the bridle. The way he answered May's questions with the same brevity and respect he gave everyone, regardless of the fact that she was 5 years old. The way he'd told those men from Millfield to have a safe trip home, and the way that had required absolutely nothing from him. She didn't say any of the things she was thinking because they were too large for the moment, and the moment was already full. What she said was, "I'm going to make soup. You need to get warm." "Clara, She'd gotten up. She stopped. I'm not... He stopped, started again. Whatever he was trying to say was not coming easily, and she had the sense that this was a man who generally said things when he had them fully formed and did not often find himself without that. I know this wasn't what you expected when you came here. I know it's gotten complicated with the men from Millfield and Pruitt out there and all of it, and I want you to know that none of that is... that I don't... He stopped again. She waited. I don't regret any of it, he said finally. Whatever happens with the rest of it, I don't regret any of it. She stood for a moment in the kitchen with her back to him, her hand on the counter, looking at nothing in particular. Then she said, "Make the soup yourself, then," which was not what she'd planned to say and was also somehow exactly right, because he made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, short and surprised and real. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the careful, neutral expression, not the engaged but controlled look, something more open than either of those. "I'm not much of a cook," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm making the soup. She exhaled. "I just needed a second." He nodded. He understood that apparently the way he understood most things, without requiring explanation. The news from Chester came 2 days later, and it was not good news, though it was the kind of bad news that at least clarified the situation. Pruitt had come back through Adderley. This time he hadn't been asking questions. He'd been leaving messages. With the storekeeper Tibbs, with the man who ran the livery, with at least 2 homesteaders on the east side of the settlement. The messages were not threats, technically. They were information. Information about Clara Whitmore. That she was wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of certain county documents from the Whitmore property before its lawful transfer. That anyone harboring her or assisting her might find themselves subject to the same investigation. It was the kind of information that was designed to isolate, to make people afraid of being connected to her, to make Gideon afraid. Chester told them this at the kitchen table on a gray afternoon, his hat in his hands, with the expression of someone delivering a message they'd rather not deliver. Martin had been in the doorway when Chester arrived and was still there, and Clara could see from his face that he'd processed what the message meant before she had, not because he was faster, but because he'd been expecting something like this, expecting the shape of the threat, even if not the specifics. "They're calling me a thief," Clara said. She said it flatly, without inflection, just identifying what they were doing. "That's what they're implying," Chester said. "Not in so many words. In this territory, they don't have to say it in so many words." "The documents aren't county property," she said. "They were in Thomas's files. They were ours." "I know that," Chester said. "But the people hearing Pruitt's story don't know that. All they know is there's a widow with a lot of kids living on Gideon's property, and now there's a story about missing documents." He spread his hands. "People fill in the blanks." Gideon had been standing near the window, looking out at the yard. He turned. "How many people in Adderley believe it?" Chester considered this honestly. "Some. Tibbs for sure. He's always been easy to push in whatever direction the wind is blowing. A few others who don't know the Whitmore family at all. The ones who've met Clara." He paused. "Less likely. But even people who don't believe it are going to think twice about association." "What about the Alderman family?" Gideon said. "And the Voss family? Have you talked to them?" "I have, after our last conversation. Alderman is willing to talk to the right person. He's got papers of his own, and he's been sitting on them because he didn't know what to do with them." Chester looked at Clara. His wife died 2 years after they lost their land. He's got a particular feeling about Pinnacle Western. "And the Voss family?" "They left the territory. Went to Oregon. I don't know if we can reach them." Clara had been listening to all of this and doing the same calculation she always did. What they had, what they needed, the gap between. The gap was still large, but it was different from before. Before she'd had no allies, no contacts, no direction. Now she had Chester, she had Alderman, she had Gideon and his connection to Harwick, and she had Thomas's documents, which were now copied in 3 separate locations. "We need Harwick," she said. "And we need him before Pruitt decides that waiting isn't working and does something more direct." "I wrote to him 10 days ago," Gideon said. "I haven't had a reply, but the mail's been slow with the weather." "Write again," she said. "Tell him it's more urgent than the first letter made it sound." He looked at her. "All right. And Chester, She looked at Chester. Can you get a message to Alderman? Tell him we want to meet. Tell him what we're building toward and ask if he'd be willing to testify to a federal investigator if it comes to that. Chester looked faintly surprised at the directness of it, and then not surprised because he'd been around her long enough by now. I can do that. Thank you. She looked around the table at the two men and her son in the doorway and thought about what Thomas would have made of this moment, this kitchen, this conversation, this collection of people who were not obligated to help her but were helping her anyway. She thought he would have approved of all of them. She thought he would have been relieved. She thought she would tell him that sometime in whatever internal conversation she still had with him in the quiet hours. She would tell him, I found the right people, Sem. The hard thing happened that night. She was checking the bunkhouse before bed, a habit she'd developed, a last round to make sure stoves were banked properly and children were covered, when Horace appeared from his corner, still somewhat pale from the creak, but otherwise returned to himself. Mama, he said, in the whisper he used when he was trying not to wake May. Yes. Is Mr. Cross going to get in trouble because of us? She sat on the edge of the nearest bed. What do you mean? Henry heard what those men said, the ones who came to talk to Mr. Cross. And Chester was here today, and I heard some of what he said through the wall. He looked at her with eyes that were too knowing for 8 years old. People are saying bad things about us, and Mr. Cross is in trouble because we're here. She thought about how to answer this, not how to make it easier. She'd been doing that since they left the homestead, and she was trying to stop, because they were old enough for something closer to truth. People are saying things that aren't accurate, she said. And yes, Mr. Cross is dealing with some of the consequences of that, because he chose to have us here. Why did he do that? Horace asked. We're not his family. It was the question underneath all the other questions, she realized. The thing all of them were circling around in their different ways. Why would a stranger choose this? What did it mean? What did it cost him, and what did he expect in return? I think, she said slowly, that some people, when they see something wrong, have to do something about it, even if it costs them. That's not the only kind of person in the world, but it's a kind that exists. Horace thought about this. Like Papa? She held on to herself quietly. Yes, like Papa. Mr. Cross went in the water without thinking, Horace said. There was something in his voice, not hero worship exactly, which she might have been less comfortable with, but something more serious and more personal, something like recognition. He did, she said. Horace was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to be better about the creek. I'm not going to go near it again. That would be a good idea. He went back to bed. Clara sat in the dim bunkhouse for a few minutes after, listening to her children breathing in the dark, the sound of them asleep and warm and safe for tonight. Horace, Henry, Ruth, Lucy, the twins, May, James, Caleb, Martin, whose bunk she could see from here, all of them here, all of them hers. Outside, the wind was moving across the ridge to the north, pushing cold air down toward the valley. The creek was somewhere in the dark, running and running, not caring what it had nearly taken, not caring about any of them. That was the thing about danger. It was impersonal. It didn't hold grudges, and it didn't make exceptions, and it didn't care how much you'd already lost. What mattered was who was standing with you when it came. She went to the door of the bunkhouse and looked across the yard toward the main house. There was a light in the kitchen window. Gideon, still up, probably at the table with something he was reading or the letter he was writing to Harwick. She stood in the cold for a moment, looking at that light. Then she went inside and closed the door against the wind. Harwick's reply came on a Monday, folded inside an envelope that had been resealed once. Someone had opened it and either read it or decided not to, Claire couldn't tell which, and delivered by a rider from Fort Laramie who'd taken 2 days to cover ground that should have taken 1. The letter was short. Harwick's handwriting was cramped and aggressive, the handwriting of a man who'd spent decades writing things he expected people to pay attention to and had developed a corresponding impatience with anything decorative. Cross. I know the name Harland Muse. I have known it for 15 years, and I have been waiting for someone to give me a reason to use what I know. Bring the widow and her documents. Come before the end of the month, or don't come at all, because I am old and my patience is not what it was, and I will not wait on anyone's convenience, including my own. E.H. Harwick. Gideon read it first, then handed it to Clara without comment. She read it twice. He sounds difficult. I told you. You said old and difficult. You didn't say... She gestured at the letter. Impatient and direct, Gideon said. Yes, all of those things. He leaned back in his chair. He also said he knows Harlan Muse's name, which means he has something we don't know about yet. That reframed the letter considerably. Clara set it on the table. When do we go? She said. The end of the month is 12 days. Travel to Fort Laramie is 2 days if the weather holds. We should leave by the end of the week to give ourselves time if something slows us. He paused. I'd like to bring Chester and Alderman if they're willing to come. Numbers matter when you walk into a room to make this kind of claim. Chester will come, Clara said. She'd known that without having to consider it. Alderman? I don't know. He's been sitting on his documents for 2 years. That's a long time to be afraid of something. It doesn't go away fast. No, Gideon agreed. It doesn't. She thought about this for a moment. Let me talk to him. Not Chester, me. I want to talk to Alderman myself. Gideon looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him, considering whether she was right about something. It was an expression that took her seriously, which she appreciated because it was not automatic with men in her experience. All right, he said. Walter Alderman was a man who had shrunk. That was Clara's first impression when she met him at his homestead the following afternoon. Not in stature, he was tall enough, but in some essential dimension. The way a person shrinks when they've been carrying something heavy for too long. His movements were careful, his speech measured, and there was a wariness in his eyes that she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror in the first weeks after Thomas died. The wary look of someone who'd learned that ordinary things could detonate. His land was modest. Not what it had been, Chester had told her. They'd driven him to a smaller claim after taking the original homestead. He was managing, barely, with a hired man and 2 older children who worked alongside him. He gave her coffee at a table that had seen better decades and listened to what she said without interrupting, which she respected. She told him about Thomas's documents, about Harlan Muse's name underlined twice, about Harwick, about the federal land office, and what it could mean to have a complaint filed there rather than at the territorial level. When she finished, Alderman was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. My wife, he said finally. Chester told me. I'm sorry. She held on for 2 years after we lost the land. The second winter took her. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. She was a healthy woman before, strong as anyone I knew. It was losing the place. The uncertainty, it broke something in her that didn't heal. I know, Clara said. I buried my husband in frozen ground with a pick and my boy's hands. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted slightly, the particular shift that happens when someone stops seeing you as a category and starts seeing you as a person. What do you need from me? He said. Your documents, your testimony, if it comes to that. Your name on a statement describing what Pinnacle Western did to your family. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not going to tell you it's without risk. I won't tell you Pruitt won't hear about it and come back to cause you problems. He might. The men behind him are invested in this staying quiet. So why should I do it? Because they killed your wife, Clara said plainly. Not with a gun, but they did it. And the only way it doesn't happen to the next family is if someone makes a public record of what they did. She paused. I can't make that choice for you, but that's the reason. Alderman set down his cup. He looked out the window at his reduced piece of land, the field that wasn't quite as good as the old one, the fence line that was always one winter behind where it needed to be, the smaller barn. When do you leave for Fort Laramie? He said. Friday. He was quiet for another moment. I'll have my documents ready by Thursday. The preparations for the trip were overlaid with the particular tension of a household that knows something is coming and is trying to function normally in the meantime. Clara had told the older children what was happening, Martin and Eliza and Caleb and James, at the kitchen table the night after her visit to Alderman. She'd told them factually, without dressing it up. They were going to Fort Laramie to present evidence to a retired judge who had contacts in federal law enforcement, and the goal was to trigger an investigation into Pinnacle Western that would expose the land fraud that had been happening in this territory for years. Martin had asked the question she'd expected. What happened if Prairie found out before they got there? What protection did they have on the road? What happened to the children while she and Gideon were gone? "You're staying here," she'd said to him. "You and Eliza both. You're in charge." "I want to come," Martin said. "I know you do." She'd looked at him steadily. "But you're more valuable here. If something happened while we were away and neither of us was on this property, 9 children would be alone. That cannot happen." Martin had not liked this, which was appropriate and which she'd expected. He was 14 and he wanted to be part of the thing that mattered, and she understood that completely because she'd raised him to be exactly that kind of person. But he'd nodded, because he'd also been raised to understand that wanting something and being right about wanting it were not the same. Eliza had been characteristically quiet during the conversation, and then, when the younger children were out of the room, she'd said to Clara, "Are you scared?" "Yes." "Good," Eliza said, "because people who aren't scared aren't paying attention, and I need you paying attention." Clara had looked at her daughter and thought, not for the first time, that Eliza was going to be formidable by 30. She was already formidable at 16, in the way of a blade that was still being sharpened. The night before they left, Prairie came to the ranch. He didn't come quietly. He came with 2 other men at a time when the winter dark had settled fully, and the property was lit only by what came through windows, and he rode directly to the front of the main house and called out. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard the horses and was at the window before the voice came, and she recognized it. That flat, unremarkable voice she'd last heard saying sorry for your trouble, ma'am, over her husband's body. "Cross, I know you're in there. I have business with the Whitmore woman." Gideon was already at the door. Clara put her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. He looked at her. "Don't go out there angry." She said it quietly. "He wants you angry. He wants you to do something that looks like aggression." Gideon's jaw was set, and his eyes had gone to a place that was controlled but not comfortable. He took a breath, took another one. "All right," he said. He opened the door and stood in it, not going out, just filling the frame. Clara stood slightly behind him where she could see and be seen. Prairie looked the same, red beard, pale eyes, the body of a man who'd spent 20 years doing physical work for people who paid him to make things happen. He had the particular ease of someone who believes the situation is in his favor. "Whitmore woman," he said, looking past Gideon at Clara. "You've got some property that doesn't belong to you. County documents that were on the Whitmore homestead at time of transfer become property of the new landholder. That's law." "That's not law," Clara said. "That's a claim you just made up." Something flickered in Prairie's pale eyes. Not anger. He was too practiced for visible anger. Something more like recalibration. "There's an easier way to handle this. You hand over what you took, we call the matter closed, and you and your children can go wherever you like, without anyone making your life more difficult than it already is." "And the land?" Clara said. "The homestead my husband built? The 11 years of work? Does that come back in this easier way?" Pruitt's expression was patient, in the way of someone who has decided to be patient as a tactic. "The transfer was legal. I'm not here to discuss the transfer." "Then you're not here to offer anything," Clara said. "I'm here to offer you the chance to walk away from something that's going to go badly for you." His voice was still even. "There are people behind this that you don't want paying attention to you, Mrs. Whitmore. People with longer reach than you've got. You've been lucky so far. That doesn't hold." Gideon said from the doorway, "You've delivered your message. Now get off my property." One of the men behind Prairie shifted in his saddle. Prairie looked at Gideon with an expression that was reassessing something. "You're making yourself part of a problem that isn't yours, Cross," Prairie said. "Appears so," Gideon said. "Get off my property." "The third time you say something like that, you mean it differently than the first time," and Prairie heard the difference. He looked at Clara once more, a long, measuring look, and then turned his horse. They rode out the way they'd come. Gideon closed the door. Clara realized she'd been holding the counter behind her without being aware of doing it. She let go of it. Her hand had left a slight impression in the cold dough she'd been working before she heard the horses, which struck her as absurd. That dough existed, that bread would still need to be made tomorrow, that the ordinary world continued operating around moments like this one. He'll know we're going tomorrow, she said. Probably. Does that change anything? Gideon thought about it honestly rather than giving her the answer that would make her feel better. It might mean the road isn't as clear as we'd like. We should leave before dawn. He looked at her. You all right? I've been better, she said. I've also been worse. He almost smiled at that. Fair enough. She went back to the bread. But they left at 4 in the morning, Clara, Gideon, Chester, and Alderman, who'd arrived the previous evening with a leather folder of documents and the expression of a man who'd made a decision and intended to live with it. They took Gideon's wagon and the 2 bays and traveled fast, pushing the horses through the pre-dawn dark on roads that were frozen hard enough to make good time. Clara had said goodbye to the children the night before. Most of the younger ones had been asleep, and she'd done it quietly, room by room, in the way of checking on sleeping children that parents have done since the beginning, adjusting a blanket here, smoothing hair there. May had woken briefly when Clara bent over her bunk and said, without opening her eyes, "Are you going somewhere?" "Yes, Bug. Back in a few days." "Okay," May said, already asleep again. Martin had been awake when she came to find him. He was sitting on his bunk in the dark, and he'd known she was coming the way he often seemed to know where she was on the property. Some instinct he'd developed since Thomas died that she found both touching and a little heartbreaking. "You have the copies?" he said. "In my bag." "And the originals?" "Separate bag. They don't travel together." She'd thought about this carefully. If something happens to one set, the other still exists. He nodded. There was a pause. "Mama, I know." "I wasn't going to say anything dramatic," he said, with a faint defensiveness that was very 14-year-old. "I know," she said again, "but I know." He'd gotten up and hugged her, which he did rarely and always briefly, and then sat back down and said, "Be careful on the road," in a voice that was trying hard to be the voice of someone who was not frightened and almost making it. "Always," she said. Top. The road to Fort Laramie in winter was not a road that forgave inattention. The frozen ground made it fast when it was flat and treacherous when it wasn't, and there were stretches where the wind came off the plains with the kind of force that made conversation impossible. They traveled mostly in silence, each of them keeping their own thoughts, which was the appropriate way to travel on a road like that with the stakes they were carrying. They stopped once at midday to rest the horses and eat something cold from the provisions Clara had packed. Standing by the wagon on the open plain, the wind coming from the northwest and the sky the particular gray of a Wyoming winter that couldn't decide whether to snow or not, Clara looked at the 3 men around her. Gideon checking the horses, Chester blowing on his cold hands, Alderman standing quiet with his leather folder under his arm, like he was afraid to put it down, and thought about the distance they'd all come to be standing in this particular wind together. Chester caught her eye and said, "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said. "Cold, but fine." "I've been thinking," he said, lowering his voice, though Gideon and Alderman were far enough away not to hear easily, "about what happens after. After Fort Laramie? After all of it. If this works, if there's an investigation, if Pinnacle Western is exposed, you'll have options you don't have now." He paused. "Some folks will say you should go back to the original homestead, try to reclaim it. I know. Is that what you want?" She looked out across the plain. The original homestead was west of Laramie. 2 days' travel from here, a different direction entirely. 11 years of work in the ground and the fences and the house Thomas had built with his hands. A cottonwood in the back corner. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what I had there. I'm not sure what I want now is the same thing." Chester looked at her with the quiet attention of a man who'd heard the real answer underneath that and was choosing to let it be what it was. "Well," he said, "you'll have the choice, which is more than you had 2 months ago." "Yes," she said, "it is." Ezra Harwick lived in a house that looked like its owner. Solid, unadorned, badly in need of some attention it was not going to get, and absolutely convinced of its own right to take up space. It sat on the western edge of Fort Laramie proper, in a neighborhood of modest houses that had each arrived at their current condition by different roads, and Harwick's was the one that looked most thoroughly lived in and least concerned about it. He answered the door himself, which Clara had half expected based on the letter. He was shorter than she'd imagined from the cramped, aggressive handwriting. Compact, with white hair and a face that had settled into an expression of general dissatisfaction with the world that she suspected was actually a form of attention. His eyes, behind the deep lines of a 70-year-old face, were very sharp. He looked at Clara for a long moment. "You're the widow," he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Yes." He looked at Gideon. "Cross." And then, looking past them both at Chester and Alderman on the walk. "Who else did you bring?" "Chester Rowe from Adderley. Walter Alderman. His land was taken by the same syndicate." Harwick's eyes went to Alderman and stayed there for a moment with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger, but held elements of both. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I made coffee. It's bad coffee, but it's hot." It was in fact bad coffee. Clara drank it anyway. But they sat around Harwick's kitchen table, which was covered in papers and books that he did not move to make room for them, only pushed to one side enough that there was surface visible. He listened to Clara present the case the way she'd organized it in her mind over the last 2 weeks. Methodical, moving from the most direct evidence to the contextual, from Thomas's documents to Alderman's, from the pattern of acquisitions to the names. When she put Thomas's notes on the table, the page with Harlan Muse's name underlined twice, Harwick picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. "Your husband identified Muse," he said. "Yes, from a distance. He didn't have anything direct, nothing that named Muse explicitly. But he'd traced the acquisitions back and found a pattern of investment through 3 different holding companies that all trace back to the same source. Through Corey Jacks," Harwick said. "You know him?" Harwick set the paper down and folded his hands on the table. 15 years ago, I presided over a case that Corey Jacks was involved in as a junior lawyer in a land dispute. There was evidence of document fraud in that case. It was not minor evidence. It was suppressed by a territorial judge who was subsequently appointed to a federal position, which is how things sometimes go in territories with the wrong kind of people in the wrong kind of offices. His expression was flat and hard. I have never forgotten that case. I stepped down from the bench 2 years later because I couldn't operate in a system that had that in it. He looked around the table. "What you have here," he said, "is the connective tissue that case was missing. Document fraud in isolation is difficult to prosecute because isolated incidents look like mistakes. What your husband built," he tapped Thomas's notes, "is the pattern. Multiple properties, multiple years, identical methods. That is not a mistake. That is an operation." Chester said quietly, "Can you do something with it?" "I know a federal land commissioner who owes me a disagreeable amount of patience," Harwick said. "He's been looking for an entry point into Pinnacle Western for 3 years. He has circumstantial material, but nothing with the evidentiary weight this has." He looked at Clara. "If you're willing to travel to Cheyenne and present this in person, I believe I can arrange for this commissioner to receive you, formally." Clara looked at Gideon. He gave her nothing. No guidance, no signal, just his honest, steady attention, leaving the decision entirely where it belonged. "Yes," she said. "We'll go to Cheyenne." "Good." Harwick picked up his bad coffee and drank it without apparent displeasure. "We'll need statements, signed and witnessed, from both of you," he nodded at Clara and Alderman, "and from Cross as a corroborating witness to events on his property." He looked at Chester. "And from you regarding what you observed in Adderley." "That's a lot of people putting their names on paper," Chester said. "It wasn't reluctance. It was acknowledgement of what it meant." "It is," Harwick said. "That's also what makes it hard to ignore and harder to suppress. One name is easy to discredit. 4 names across 2 separate families and 2 unrelated witnesses is a different matter." They worked until the light outside the window changed. 4 hours at Harwick's table, with the old man producing document forms from somewhere in the pile of papers that Clara would not have found in a week of searching, and directing the drafting of statements with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this for 40 years. His handwriting on his own portions was that same cramped, aggressive script. But he was precise. And when he said, "That word is wrong, use this one instead," he was always right about why. Alderman, who'd said almost nothing since they arrived, signed his statement with his full name in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone doing something they intend to stand behind. When he finished, he looked up and found Clara watching him, and she gave him a small nod. He nodded back, once. They stayed the night at a boarding house in Fort Laramie and started back the following morning. The Cheyenne trip would have to be a separate journey 2 weeks from now if the weather held, which meant going back to the ranch, waiting, and keeping the documents safe for that additional stretch of time. On the road back, Gideon rode beside her on Pearl, while Chester drove the wagon with Alderman. For a while they just rode. The landscape was open here, the plains stretching out in the winter light, with the particular stillness that came after a storm had passed, and before the next one arrived. It was the kind of landscape that either made you feel very small or very clear about what mattered, and today it was doing the second thing. "You did well in there," Gideon said. "Harwick did the heavy lifting. Harwick knows the law. You knew the case." He looked at the road ahead. "Your husband was a careful man." "He was," she said. And then, after a moment, because it was a thought she'd been carrying since the kitchen table in Fort Laramie, and it needed somewhere to go. "He built something that I couldn't see while he was building it. He was doing it for us, for the family. He just never got to finish it." She paused. "I keep thinking about how he'd have felt about this particular moment, on this particular road with these people. What do you think he'd feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Relieved," she said. "Not happy. I don't think happy is the right word for any of this, but relieved that it's moving, that it's not just sitting there, buried, the way so many things like this get buried." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He should know you're the one finishing it." He'd probably point out that it's not finished yet. "True," Gideon said. "He sounds like he was a practical man." "He was," Clara said. "Very." They rode for another stretch in silence that was not uncomfortable. The horses moved steadily. The sky held its gray. "Clara," Gideon said. "Yes." "When this is done." He stopped, and she could hear him choosing words with the same care he brought to most things. "When the investigation is started and the case is filed and you have whatever options you're going to have, I want you to know that my offer stands. The ranch, the work, all of it." He paused. "Regardless of what Harwick's commissioner turns up or what choices you make afterward, the offer doesn't depend on the outcome." She looked at him riding beside her, this man she'd known for less than 2 months, who'd pulled her son from a river and gone up against Pruitt in his own doorway and sat in a difficult old man's kitchen for 4 hours without complaint. "I know," she said. "I'm not sure you do," he said. "I'm telling you directly so there isn't any question." She held Pearl's reins in her cold hands and looked at the road ahead and said, after a moment, "I heard you the first time, Gideon." He looked at her. "All right. But thank you for saying it again." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. They rode the rest of the way in the winter light, 2 days back through the frozen territory with the documents in their bags and the warrant of Harwick's involvement in their pocket, and the children waiting at the end of the road. When they came back to the ranch on the second evening, Martin was at the fence line when the wagon came in sight, and he stood there watching them come. And when Clara rode close enough to see his face, she could see the breath he let out. The held breath he'd been holding for 2 days, releasing now that he could see they were back and whole. She didn't say anything about it when she got down from Pearl. She just touched his shoulder as she passed, and he said nothing, and that was enough between them. Inside, the bunkhouse was warm and loud in the way it was when all 9 of them were contained in it, and May came running the moment Clara opened the door with her tin cup in one hand and her arms out, and Clara caught her and held her and breathed in the smell of her hair. "You were gone a long time," May said. 2 days, Clara said. "That's a long time," May said, with the authority of 5 years. "It is," Clara agreed. "It is." Over May's head, she met Eliza's eyes across the room. Eliza raised her eyebrows in the question that was really many questions. Clara gave her a single nod that meant, yes, it went. Yes, we're moving. Yes, there is still more to do, but we're moving. Eliza nodded back. Through the bunkhouse window, Clara could see the light on in the main house kitchen. Gideon, already doing whatever needed doing next, because that was who he was. The kind of man who didn't rest in the middle of something. She was not ready to rest either, but tonight she held her daughter and listened to the sound of her children and let herself be where she was for a few minutes, without thinking about Cheyenne or Pruitt or Harlan Muse or anything that was coming. Just here. Just this. It was enough. The 2 weeks before Cheyenne passed the way, weeks pass when you are waiting for something large. slowly in the days and fast in retrospect, so that when Clara looked back on them afterward, she could only account for fragments. The morning Caleb's cough finally cleared completely, and how she'd stood in the cold yard after sending him off to work with Gideon and let herself feel the relief of it, which was considerable. The afternoon Lucy asked if she could help with the documents, not to do anything with them, but just to understand what they were, and Clara had sat with her for an hour explaining what each one meant, and watched her daughter's serious face work through it. The evening Martin came in from the fence line with a split knuckle and a story about how it happened that was funnier than it should have been, and how all of them had laughed at the table in the way that happens when people have been tense for a long time and something small and ordinary provides the release. And the nights? The nights were their own category. Clara slept better than she had since leaving the homestead, which she noticed and did not entirely understand because the situation was not resolved, and Pruitt was still out there and Cheyenne was still ahead of them. But there was something about having a direction, about knowing the next step, even when you couldn't see the step after it, that allowed the body to rest in a way pure survival did not. Gideon was different in those 2 weeks in a way she observed without commenting on. He was still the same man, the same brevity, the same quality of attention, the same flat practicality about everything from fence posts to legal strategy. But there was something less sealed about him. He talked more at the table. He asked the children questions that weren't only about the work they'd been doing. One evening, he taught Henry and Horace a card game that Clara had never seen before, and that may or may not have been something he'd invented on the spot, given the way the rules seemed to shift whenever he was losing, which the twins found enormously suspicious and completely delightful. She did not examine what she thought about all of this too closely. There was still too much ahead of them for that, and she was a practical woman, and the practical thing was to get to Cheyenne first and see what was standing afterward. They left for Cheyenne on a Thursday with Harwick, who had insisted on coming and who traveled, it turned out, with a carpet bag that weighed approximately as much as a small child and contained what appeared to be every document he'd ever found important in his entire legal career. He did not explain this. Clara did not ask. Alderman came again. Chester came. And this time Martin came too because Clara had looked at him across the breakfast table on Wednesday morning and said, "You're coming with us." And he'd gone very still for a moment and then said, "All right," in a voice that tried to be casual and didn't manage it. And she'd gone back to her coffee without making anything of the moment, which was the right call. Eliza was in charge at the ranch. Clara had told her this formally, which Eliza had received with the composure of someone who'd been doing the job already and appreciated having it acknowledged. Gideon had left instructions with the hired man he'd brought on for the winter, a quiet fellow named Trace who was competent and reliable and unlikely to cause or invite trouble in their absence. The night before they left, Clara had gone to each child again. She'd become something of a nighttime ritual, this going around. Not quite tuck-in, because most of them were too old for that now, but something adjacent to it. A presence in the dark. A check of the temperature in the room, the quality of breathing, the sense of whether everyone was all right. May was awake again. She seemed to have a sense for these departures that Clara couldn't explain. "You're going away again," May said. "Yes." "Is it the same reason as before?" "The same reason, yes. To make sure the people who hurt our family are held accountable." May thought about this. She was 5, but she was 5 in the way of a child who had absorbed more than she was supposed to have to absorb, and it had made her thoughtful in a way that was not entirely childlike anymore. Are they bad men? They did bad things. Whether that makes them bad men, Clara considered it honestly, because May somehow always made her consider things honestly. I think some of them knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care, and some of them probably told themselves a story about why it was all right. That second kind is in some ways worse, because they'll keep doing it. May processed this. "Is Mr. Cross coming with you?" "Yes." "Okay," May said. She adjusted her tin cup, which she kept on a small shelf near her bunk, and which had traveled from the homestead to Adderley to this ranch, and showed every mile of it. "He went in the water for Horace." "He did." "So he's one of the good ones." "Yes," Clara said. "He's one of the good ones." May settled back against her pillow, apparently satisfied. "Come back soon," she said, already half asleep. "As soon as I can," Clara said. "Uta, Cheyenne was larger than Fort Laramie and noisier in the way of places that hadn't quite decided what they were yet. Half city, half frontier, with buildings that were trying to be permanent alongside structures that were clearly intended to be temporary and had simply overstayed. The federal land office was in a building that made up for its modest size with an aggressive solidity, as if it had decided that looking substantial was the next best thing to being powerful. The land commissioner's name was Arthur Vane, no relation, as far as anyone knew, to the Aldous Vane who'd written Thomas his warning letter years ago, which was either coincidence or the territory being smaller than it seemed. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the tired eyes of someone who'd spent years dealing with exactly the kind of corruption they were bringing him and had learned not to show surprise, because surprise implied you'd once had illusions, and he'd given those up some time ago. He received them in a room with a long table and chairs that didn't match, and he looked at the documents Clara laid out with the methodical attention of a man doing a job he took seriously. Harwick sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, which was unusual enough that Clara kept glancing at him. She understood it later. Harwick had delivered what he'd come to deliver, which was his presence and his credibility and the weight of his reputation in this room. And now he was letting the evidence do what evidence did when it was handled correctly. Vane asked questions. Good questions. The kind that came from someone who already understood the landscape of what they were looking at and was identifying the specific gaps. He asked about the survey discrepancy in Thomas's original homestead filing, and Clara walked him through what the fourth document showed. He asked about Harlan Muse, and she walked him through Thomas's notes. He asked Alderman about the Alderman homestead case specifically, and Alderman answered in a voice that was quiet and steady and entirely without self-pity, which was its own kind of devastating testimony. Martin, sitting 2 chairs down from Clara, didn't speak unless addressed, but he was watching everything with the careful attention she recognized as his father's habit of learning a room before deciding what to do in it. The session lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Vane set down the last document and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone doing a calculation they don't want to do in front of anyone. "What you've brought me," he said finally, "is the foundation of a federal investigation into Pinnacle Western Development Company and its associated principals." He looked at Clara. "I want to be clear about what that means. It means I will open a formal investigation. It does not mean arrests happen tomorrow. It does not mean land is returned next week. These things take time because they have to be done in a way that holds, not in a way that collapses when their lawyers push back." "I understand that," Clara said. "It also means that from this point, anyone who interferes with witnesses in this matter is interfering with a federal investigation, which is a different category of crime than what they've been committing so far and carries different consequences." He looked at her steadily. "That includes Pruitt. If he comes to your property again, you send word to this office immediately." "Yes," she said. He looked at the documents one more time. "Harlan Muse," he said, almost to himself. He said the name the way Harwick had said it, with 15 years of history behind the 2 words. "We've been trying to get a clear line to him for a very long time." He looked at Thomas's notes again, the page with the name underlined twice. "Your husband was thorough." "He was," Clara said. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore." He said it simply, without the performative condolence that people sometimes offered as social ritual. He said it like he meant it. He did good work. She held herself together, which required a particular quality of effort in that moment. "Thank you," she said. They got the news about the arrests in stages, the way news traveled in the territory, first by rumor, then by letter, then by the slow confirmation that comes when the thing you've been waiting for finally stops being a possibility and becomes a fact. Corey Jacks was arrested in Millfield 6 weeks after the Cheyenne meeting. The territorial newspaper described it in 3 lines, which told Clara that the people who ran the newspaper had connections they were protecting, but it was 3 lines more than nothing. Chester brought the paper out to the ranch and read it aloud at the kitchen table with an expression that mixed satisfaction with the awareness that satisfaction was not quite the right feeling for something this serious. The county official named Bassett resigned his position 2 weeks after that, which wasn't an arrest, but was the kind of thing that happened when someone had been told exactly what was coming and chose to leave before it arrived. Clara heard about it from Harwick, who wrote a brief, precise letter that said, among other things, The commissioner is moving methodically, and I believe he will reach the top of the structure, though not quickly. Be patient. Be available when called. Pruitt disappeared. That was the word Chester used when he came out with the news in late February. Disappeared, which could mean he'd run or could mean something worse had happened to him, courtesy of the people above him who decided he was a liability. Clara didn't know and found, after sitting with that uncertainty for a few days, that she was not going to let it occupy too much of her mind. Pruitt was one instrument in a larger structure. The structure was what mattered. Harlan Muse was arrested on a Thursday in March in Cheyenne at his offices. Vane's office sent Clara a formal notification, a single page with the federal seal at the top. She read it standing at the kitchen counter while the stove ticked behind her, and then she read it again, and then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat where she kept the things she intended to remember. She stood at the window for a while after that, looking out at the yard where Daniel and James were hauling water and the twins were having some kind of disagreement near the barn that appeared to be escalating toward the physical, which it would not reach because Ruth was walking toward them with the expression that always resolved these situations before they fully arrived. Everything ordinary, everything continuing. She thought about Thomas at his kitchen table, making his careful notes by lamplight, building something in secret, trying to protect them, running out of time. She thought about the way she'd felt in those first days on the road, the specific quality of that desperation, the weight of 9 children and $43 and a world that kept closing its doors. She thought about the man in Haverford and his mustache and his dismissal, and the woman in Dalton and the closed door, and what it had felt like to read the coldness in people's faces when they looked at her family and saw only a problem. She had not forgotten any of it. She did not intend to. What she understood now, that she hadn't fully understood then, was that the cruelty of those people had not been personal. They hadn't hated her. They'd seen what it cost to care about someone else's crisis, and they'd done the arithmetic and decided the cost was too high. It was a particular kind of cowardice that dressed itself up as practicality, and it was very common, and it did enormous damage in the world. And the only counter to it was people who did the arithmetic differently, who looked at the cost and paid it anyway. Chester had paid it. Alderman, in his frightened and grief-worn way, had paid it. Harwick had been waiting 15 years for the chance to pay it. Gideon had gone in the water without thinking about the cost at all. That was the thing about survival. The bare version of it, the kind Clara had been doing since Pruitt's men appeared in her yard, was that it consumed everything. Every calculation, every hour, every reserve of energy went toward the immediate. Food, shelter, safety, the next step. You kept moving because stopping felt fatal, and you did not have the capacity to think about anything beyond the next necessary thing. What she was learning now, slowly, in the warmth of a kitchen that had become familiar and the company of people who had chosen to be here, was that surviving was not the same as living. And she was not entirely sure when the transition had happened or if it was still happening, but she was somewhere in the middle of it, and it felt different from anything she'd expected. The offer of the original homestead came in April, in a letter from Vane's office. Part of the federal investigation's remediation was the voiding of Pinnacle Western's fraudulent land claims, which meant the properties reverted to the last legitimate holders. In the Whitmore case, that meant Clara. She was entitled to reclaim the homestead west of Laramie. The letter said so in formal language with the weight of federal authority behind it. The cottonwood in the back corner, Thomas's grave underneath it. She could go back. She sat with the letter for 2 days before saying anything to anyone. She sat with it the way you sit with a decision that touches something deep enough that you need to feel all of it before you can think clearly about any of it. On the second evening, she showed it to Gideon. He read it at the kitchen table, then set it down. He did not say anything immediately, which she'd come to understand was how he processed things that mattered to him. "What do you want to do?" he asked, finally. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April wind was doing something tentative and not entirely cold, the first suggestion of the season turning, the ground starting to think about thawing. "What does going back mean to you?" She thought about it honestly. "It means Thomas didn't lose. It means they didn't win. It means the place he built still belongs to us." She paused. "It also means going back to a place where everything that happened is embedded in the land. The yard where he died. The room where the children were when Pruitt's men came. Every morning would start with that. And staying here? Gideon said. Staying here means this. She gestured, which was not a precise gesture, but somehow encompassed the kitchen, the window with the ridge visible in the last of the evening light, the sound of children from the bunkhouse, all of it. It means what this has become, which is something I didn't expect and didn't plan, and which is... She stopped. He waited. Which is mine, she said. In a different way than the homestead was mine. The homestead was ours, Thomas's and mine, and I loved it, and I'm grateful we had it. But this is something I found myself. On a road I didn't choose, with people I didn't know, and it turns out to be... She exhaled. I didn't know I could build something twice. Gideon looked at her with that direct brown gaze. You're not giving up the homestead by staying, he said carefully. You could deed it to someone. Alderman's been looking for land that's better than what he has now. Or Martin, when he's older. It doesn't have to be abandoned to be kept. She hadn't thought of that. The simplicity of it, the rightness of it. Thomas's land going to a family that Pinnacle Western had also wronged, the land becoming something useful in the hands of someone who'd earned the chance at it. She felt the idea settle somewhere that recognized it. That's a good thought, she said. I have them occasionally. She looked at him. He was looking at the letter again, or pretending to, and there was something in the set of his face that was careful in a way that was different from his usual careful. Gideon, she said. He looked up. I'm staying, she said. That's the answer. I wanted you to know that's the answer before anything else. Whatever had been careful in his face did something then. Not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man, and she did not expect or want that. Just a slight release of something held. All right, he said. I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. I have somewhere else to go. I'm choosing this. Clara. His voice was very even. I know. She looked at him for another moment, then looked down at the letter on the table between them. The federal seal. Vane's signature. The formal language of justice arriving too late to undo what had been done, but arriving nonetheless, which was more than it usually did. I want to talk to Martin first, she said, about the homestead and alderman. He should be part of that decision. It was his father's land. That's right, Gideon said. And I want... She stopped. Started again. I want this to be actual, whatever this is. I don't want it to be something we don't name because naming it is uncomfortable. I've spent enough of my life being careful about things that should have been said. He was very still in the way he went still when something mattered. What do you want to name it? A family, she said. The one that formed while we weren't looking. You and me and 9 children and a ridge that cuts the wind and a kitchen that feeds more people than it was built for. She held his gaze. That's what I want to name it. Gideon Cross was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was not entirely steady, which was the first time she'd heard it be anything other than completely steady, and it did something to her that she didn't have words for. That's what it is, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen with the evening light going and the sounds of her children coming through the walls. She told Martin about the homestead the following morning, walking the fence line he'd been working, just the two of them in the early April air that still had cold in it but was trying. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, looking at the fence post he'd just set, the work of his hands visible and solid in the thawing ground. Papa would have said to give it to someone who needed it, he said finally. I know. Alderman lost everything too, and his wife. Martin was quiet again. It seems right. The land going to someone Pinnacle Western also hurt. Yes. He turned to look at her. He was 14 and tall for it, getting taller, and sometimes she looked at him and saw Thomas so clearly it took effort to see Martin instead. You're happy here, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Getting there, she said, which is more than I expected. Me too, he said. Then, with the deliberate casualness of a teenager broaching something they've thought about more than they want to admit. Gideon's all right. He is. He's not. He's not trying to replace Papa. I've been watching. He's not doing that. No, Clara said. He's not. He's doing something different, something that doesn't require replacing anything. Martin nodded, processing. Okay, he said, which from Martin meant, I've accepted this. I'll stop requiring additional conversation about it now. He picked up his tools. I'm going to finish this section before lunch. Okay, she said. She watched him go back to work. Her son, her firstborn, the boy who'd driven the wagon through 5 days of rejection and made the last watch of every night and held the rope when Gideon pulled Horace from the creek. He was going to be a good man. He already was one, in the ways that mattered. Thomas had started it. The road had finished it in ways neither of them would have chosen, but there it was. Her son, setting fence posts in April ground, becoming the shape of who he was going to be. They had aldermen to the ranch for dinner in May, when the ground was green and the creek was running the comfortable middle volume that came after snowmelt. He came alone, with the leather folder of his documents because he seemed unable to travel without them, and sat at the kitchen table with Clara and Gideon while the children provided the chaotic and warm background noise of 9 people in an adjacent space that had become completely their own. Clara had written to Vane's office about transferring the homestead claim. The legal process was its own labyrinthine undertaking, and Harwick had agreed to oversee it in the manner of a man who had decided to spend his retirement being useful whether he wanted to or not. But the intention was established, the direction was clear, and Alderman had sat very still when Clara told him what she was proposing, and then said, I don't know how to thank you for this, in the voice of a man who actually didn't know. You testified, Clara said. You put your name on that table in Cheyenne when it would have been easier not to. That's not nothing. Still. Alderman. She said his name the way she sometimes said Gideon's, but direct, meant to land. Thomas would have wanted the land with someone who'd use it right. There's no one I'd rather give it to. He'd nodded then and looked at his coffee and didn't say anything else about it, which was the right response. At dinner, May installed herself next to Alderman with the confident manner she used with adults she'd decided to accept, and told him at some length about the horses on the property and which ones had distinct personalities. He listened with more attention than most adults gave a 5-year-old, which May recognized and rewarded by escalating to increasingly detailed horse observations. She doesn't run out of things to say, Alderman observed to Clara at a lull. Not yet, Clara agreed. We're waiting to see if it happens. Alderman smiled, a real smile, which Clara hadn't seen on his face before. It changed him considerably. She thought about the letter from Vane's office with the formal language of justice, and about Alderman's wife who'd held on 2 years after losing the land and then hadn't been able to hold on anymore. And she thought that whatever justice meant in a situation like this, it was never exact, and it was never enough, and it arrived too late to undo anything. But it arrived. And in arriving, it made possible the version of the future where Alderman smiled at a 5-year-old's horse opinions over someone else's dinner table, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, something. That was what she'd come to believe about justice through all of it, that it was not restoration. It was not the return of what had been lost. It was the closing of a door through which damage had been flowing, so that what was left could have a chance to become something. It didn't give Thomas back. It didn't give Alderman's wife back. It didn't give any of them the years they'd lost or the ease they'd never had. But it stopped the door from swinging, and it mattered that it stopped. And the people who'd helped close it had done something that deserved to be called good, even if the word felt smaller than the thing. Okay? Summer came to the Cross Ranch with the unhurried confidence of something that had been here before and intended to be here again. The days stretched long. The ridge to the north went from gray to green, and the creek settled into the pleasant, steady sound it made when it was neither threatening nor scarce. The children spread through the property the way children spread when they have space to do it, each of them finding their place, their work, their small domains. Martin was on the cattle work full-time now, riding with Gideon in the early mornings with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years rather than months. James had become Trace's shadow in the barn, developing opinions about horses that had started to resemble something like expertise. Caleb and Daniel worked the fields, growing into the kind of workers who didn't need direction because they'd internalized what needed doing and why. Ruth had discovered she could grow things, She'd started a kitchen garden in May, stubbornly, in ground that resisted her initially, and by July it was producing in a way that astonished even Gideon, who'd tried the same patch 2 years running and given up. She had her mother's persistence and her father's patience with slow processes, and the combination was apparently well suited to gardening. Lucy had started teaching May her letters, with a gravity that suggested she'd found a vocation. May was a mixed student, attentive when interested, magnificently absent when not. But she could now write her own name and the names of every animal on the property, and the word creek in large uneven capitals, which she'd written on a piece of paper and nailed to the fence post nearest the water as what she described as a warning. The twins remained the twins. They'd recently decided to take turns pretending to be each other, which fooled no one but provided them with enormous entertainment. It was not a life without difficulty. Ranch work was hard and constant, and the weather did not negotiate, and there were weeks when everything that could go wrong did, and money was always the conversation happening just underneath the other conversations. And 9 children growing at the rate children grow required resources that required planning, that required work, that didn't stop. But it was full. That was the word Clara kept coming back to. Not perfect, which it wasn't. Not easy, which it had never been, and probably wouldn't be, but full. Full of the kind of texture that comes when people who have been through real things together stop performing for each other and simply are who they are. Gideon had proposed in June. He'd done it without ceremony, which she'd expected, and without extensive preamble, which she'd also expected, and in the kitchen, which was where they always seemed to end up for the conversations that mattered, which seemed right. He'd said, "I'd like us to be married, if that's what you want." She'd said, "It's what I want." He'd nodded, and that had been most of it, except that he'd reached across the table and taken her hand the same way she'd taken his in April, and they'd sat like that for a while without saying anything else, because some things don't need more words than that. They were married in August, in the yard of the ranch, with Chester officiating in his capacity as someone who'd once done this and was willing to do it again, and all 9 children present, and Alderman and Harwick both, and a few families from Adderley who'd become something like community over the months. It was not a large ceremony. The dress Clara wore was not new. The day was hot, and the flies were interested in everything, and Henry knocked over a cup at the meal afterward and went rigid again with the anticipatory look that he still hadn't fully lost. And Gideon righted the cup and said, "Happens," exactly the way he had the very first night. And Henry looked at Horace, and Horace looked back with the expression of 8-year-olds who have filed something permanently. May sat on the fence and watched the whole ceremony with her tin cup in her lap, and a solemn expression that partway through slowly became a smile. Nobody told her to smile. She just did, the way children smile when something that was wrong has come right in a way they can feel even if they can't articulate. In the evening, when the guests had gone and the children were variously asleep or winding toward it, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard in the blue summer dark. She could hear the creek in the distance, steady and quiet, doing what it had always done regardless of what happened on its banks. She thought about the woman she'd been in October, on the frozen road outside Laramie with $43 and a dead husband and 9 children looking at her like she was the last solid thing between them and the dark. She thought about what that woman had believed about the future, which was not much in the specific terms of possibility, because the future had contracted down to survive this day and then the next one, and don't look past that because you cannot afford to. She had survived those days. She had found, in surviving them, people she hadn't known she'd find, and a life she hadn't known she could build, and a version of herself she hadn't been sure existed, one that could go 4 rounds with a land syndicate, present evidence to a federal commissioner, bury her husband and carry her children across a frozen plain, and still, at the end of it, choose something new instead of retreating into the shape of the old grief. That was the thing nobody told you about loss. Not the loss itself, which everyone told you about in various ways, usually inadequate. The thing nobody told you was what came after the survival. The long stretch of ordinary time that followed extraordinary difficulty. And what you were supposed to do with it, and who you were supposed to be in it. She thought the answer was, whoever you actually are, now that you've been tested enough to find out. She heard Gideon come into the kitchen behind her. She didn't turn around. He came to stand beside her at the window, and they looked out at the yard together, at the dark ridge and the summer stars and the quiet settled shape of the life they'd made out of what had been left. Everyone down? She said. Most of them. May's talking to herself. She does that. I know. A pause. Henry put the tin cup on May's shelf when she wasn't looking, so now she has two. Clara turned to look at him. When did he do that? Tonight, after dinner. Gideon's expression was the one she'd come to love most. The almost not a smile, the thing his face did when something had reached him that he hadn't expected. He didn't say anything about it, just put it there and went to bed. She turned back to the window. Something in her chest did something complicated, the way it still sometimes did when her children were more themselves than she'd known to hope for. She'd raised them in hard years and harder months, and they kept showing her what they'd become in it, and it kept being more than she'd asked. He's going to be all right, she said. Not a question. Yeah, Gideon said, all of them are. She didn't say anything to that. She just stood at the window in her kitchen, in her home, beside the man she'd chosen, listening to the creak in the dark and the sound of her children breathing somewhere in the rooms behind her, every one of them present, every one of them safe, every one of them wanted, in this place, by these people, completely and without condition. It was not the life she'd planned. She'd planned another life, with Thomas, on different land, and she had loved that life. And she did not pretend she hadn't. Grief was not something that resolved into nothing. It persisted, the way Thomas's careful handwriting persisted in the leather satchel she still kept, the way the cottonwood persisted on land that now belonged to Alderman and his children, the way some things that end don't disappear but become part of the ground you stand on. But she was standing. That was what she knew, at the end of it, after everything. The frozen road, the closed doors, the 9 mouths to feed with $43 and no direction, the documents and the river and Pruitt on the doorstep and the long cold winter. She was standing in a kitchen that was hers, in a life that was hers, beside a family she had built from what remained. Surviving, she'd learned, was staying alive. Living was something you did after that, something you had to choose, something that required you to stop looking only at what you'd lost and start looking at what was still in your hands. She had 9 children and a man who went in the water without thinking, and a ridge that cut the wind, and a garden that Ruth had grown from resistant ground, and a tin cup that now had a companion on May's shelf because a frightened boy had quietly decided to be generous. She had enough. More than enough. More than she'd known to ask for on the road in October. More than she'd thought the world was willing to give. She put her hand in Gideon's and held it, and the summer night held all of them, and the creek ran on.